All right. Well, why don't we begin? I see that most participants are here, quite a few of you, so thank you all for coming out today. Before I begin, I just wanted to give acknowledge the land on which I am on today, and most of us gathering, at least in the Santa Cruz area, is the traditional unceded territory of the Yupi of the Awaswas Nation, today represented by the Amamutsan tribal band. These lands have been theirs for millennia, and they continue to steward the land through the Amamutsan Land Trust. I'd also like to thank everyone who made this event possible. So our feminist studies crew, including Lisa and Taylor, as well as our Zoom pair extraordinaire, Luis. Thank you all for being here. Very excited for the conversation today. Some of you may know that today's talk is part of my Indigenous Feminisms course, this particular quarter here at UC Santa Cruz, so hence the UC Santa Cruz. And we hope that most of you were able to watch the film in advance. We still live here. Part of our discussion today will take up that history, as well as a reflection on what the past 10 years have brought to the Wampanoag language and Wampanoag language reclamation in particular. So before I introduce our esteemed guest today, I just want to offer a little background. So Dr. Hicks Greendeer and I used to work together at a center in Oakland called the American Indian Child Resource Center. I believe you were working on your master's at the time, I think. And some years after that, we also co-authored an article with the wonderful Dr. Carrie Chu, who I believe is in the audience today. So it's really wonderful to have you here today. And I want to give you a proper introduction, so let me read that off as well. So Dr. Nitana Hicks Greendeer, a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, has worked for the past 15 years with the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project as a teacher, researcher, and curriculum developer, and currently as the head of school for the Wampanoag Language Immersion School. She has served her tribal community as the director of the education department for the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. Dr. Hicks Greendeer teaches in the Native American and Indigenous Studies program at Brown University, previously as a presidential postdoc, and now as an adjunct professor in the Native American and Indigenous Studies program in the American Studies department. Through her education, language, and academic work, Dr. Hicks Greendeer works to give Wampanoag children positive, culturally relevant educational experiences as a means of decolonization and prevention to increase personal and community wellness. So please welcome Dr. Nitana Hicks Greendeer. Thank you so much for being here, Nitana. And I believe you have a PowerPoint presentation as well, right? So we'll begin with that first.
Okay.
Great.
Tapatosh. So let me share my screen. Okay, you see that?
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, so since everyone, well, not everyone maybe, but since most of you have seen the film, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project has been doing since that film has been out, which has been about a little over a decade now. And so we've had quite a bit of progress since then. I also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of how I came to this place of being, involved in language. And so for me, when I graduated from college, I moved back home to Mashpee. I'm from Mashpee, which is the place of my that my tribe is from. I'm Mashpee Wampanoag, and I started taking Wampanoag language classes. And didn't really, I just sort of thought it might be cool to take them. I didn't really have any long-term goals related to learning. And I really didn't know anything about the language. Our language hadn't been spoken, as you know, for many generations. And so it was pretty new at that time. And there weren't very many speakers at that point. Really just the people who were working, pretty much full time on the language at the time. So I started taking classes and caught on pretty quickly. And so as I was taking them, Jessie, who was my teacher at the time, Jessie Baird, then Jessie Firmino, asked me if I would consider getting a master's degree to take on language as more of a, potential career. And so I applied to the Indigenous Languages Institute at MIT, and I was accepted for the following year. And so I basically spent the next couple of years just learning Wampanoag grammar, which for me was really, in some ways, really easy because I'm kind of good at that sort of thing. But in other ways, really, really challenging in that it was kind of a relearning of a lot of cultural things that I had grown up with, and sort of I just gained a lot of different understanding than I previously had about some of the things that I grew up with, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But so as I finished my master's and started working and teaching Wampanoag language, sort of on a part-time basis, and then actually moved to California and spent some time working with Native youth in Oakland, and realized through that work that I was incredibly lucky to have grown up where my tribe was from. While all of the students that I worked with had a really strong sense of Native identity, there were some of them that didn't really have a strong identification with their specific tribe. And so I felt like if at some point I was going to have children, I would want to really make sure that that was something that I gave them, that same opportunity that I had. And so that in combination with the work with youth that I was doing, some of whom were not having the most positive school experiences, made me think about wanting to kind of combine those things for children in my own community. And so I applied to a PhD program in education with the thought of maybe eventually starting a school at home. And so I moved back to the East Coast and started school at Boston College. And about 2 months into that program, I got a call from Jessie again, and she asked me if I was interested in becoming a language apprentice, and to work full-time, just basically speaking Wampanoag and learning to be a fluent speaker in Wampanoag, along with a group of people who would eventually open a school. And so it was really just the perfect match for what I was looking to do and for what the project was looking to do. And so I came back home and got more heavily involved in that. And so that brings me to what we've been up to for the last several years. And so for those of you who didn't watch the film, just a little bit of background on the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project. Although that spelling right there of Wampanoag is actually Wôpanâak, so that's the Wampanoag pronunciation. Wampanoag is more like the anglicized pronunciation. So WLRP serves 4 Wampanoag communities. It's a partnership between Aquinnah, Assonet, Herring Pond, or Secwepemc, and Mashpee communities. And all of the communities, anyone from a household that has a citizen of those tribes can take classes, and anyone who is not enrolled in those communities, if they live with someone who is, classes are open to them as well. And the idea is that it supports the learner, the tribal people in learning, if people in their house are also learning. The WLRP is governed by a committee and a board of directors, and everyone is a language learner or teacher. We also, at this point, have 3 credentialed Wampanoag linguists, which for language revitalization and reclamation projects is really, really amazing. It so happens that all 3 of us are Wampanoag, so I'm one of them with my work at MIT. Jessie is one of them, and Jessie's daughter, Tracy, is the most recent. She just graduated this past May. So some things that we've been doing. So as I mentioned, it was 2010 when we first applied for a Master Apprentice grant, which we were awarded. And Master Apprentice, for those of you who may not be familiar, is a model for language learning where non-speakers are paired with, in most cases, usually a first language speaker or fluent speaker, but because we don't have any first language speakers, Jessie was our master speaker as the most fluent Wampanoag speaker that we have. So since 2010, we've had several other federal grants, private grants. We have a lot of very generous donors that have supported the work that we've been doing. And that work has included community classes, immersion camps. Most of those kinds of things have been going on for a lot longer than the last 10 years, but they've continued and they've increased. We have an elders program, we have after school programming, summer camp programming. We are teaching Wampanoag language in the public schools in Mashpee. We now have an online teaching program, and we also have an immersion school. And so I'll talk a little bit about each of those things now. So for community classes and the immersion camp, so classes are typically taught throughout southeastern Massachusetts. So in the communities where tribes are based, so Mashpee, Aquina, which is on Martha's Vineyard, those are probably the two places where most classes take place. But we have large populations of Wampanoag people in cities. So there's been classes in Boston and New Bedford and Providence, which is about an hour away, maybe off Cape. And so these classes have various different, different teachers have different approaches. So some of them are workbook classes for grammar. Sometimes they're immersion style. We use a few different immersion techniques, total physical response, or there's a game called Where Are Your Keys, or a game method called Where Are Your Keys that we've been trained in, that we use sometimes. And then some of the classes are more practical applications. So we have phrase books, which you can sort of see the cover of here. And that just will take you through things like, how are you? I'm hungry. It's, go play outside, those kinds of things that you might want to use in your home. And so community classes are definitely where we reach the most people. It has the widest range of people from all ages and all communities. And it's definitely sort of like the mainstay of the programming that we do. In Mashpee, there is a program called the Elders Lunch and Learn. And so twice a week, it's a class strictly for elders. And they come in, they have a 1 hour language lesson and then have lunch. It's a lot less like strict in terms of the framework. So like if the teachers or if the students are wanting to, talk about, I don't know, how to count this week, then we count this week. It's kind of, it's really led by them and what they would like to do. And it's really important to the elders to have their own class. It's been a challenge for some of them to sort of come to language as they're getting older. And so it's created a place where they can, feel comfortable learning at a pace that might not be as fast as younger adults or children, and have their peers in class with them. And it's been really successful. And we have a group of it always kind of fluctuates who attends, but we have a really great group of committed elders who come almost every day. So it's been a great program. Our after school program and turtle camps have been offered in the past by Mashpee and Aquina. They are, the after school program usually is language classes in the schools or in the tribal offices. We've also offered camps that have ranged between being, immersion at times or having language lessons. We've also had camps during vacation weeks and things like that. And they are usually in collaboration with the education departments at the tribes. sort of put those on. We do a lot of work with education departments. Right now, we are in our 4th year of teaching Wampanoag language in the Mashpee High School. So we have curriculum for Wampanoag 1, 2, 3, and 4. At the moment, we actually don't have any Wampanoag 4 students because the ones who would have been in 4 graduated last year. So right now it's just 1, 2, and 3, but we'll have 4 again next year. One of the really cool things that has come of this is in Massachusetts, you can test in your second language that you've learned in school for a seal of biliteracy to go on your diploma. And that's now an option in Wampanoag. So we had 1 student test for that this year. So that's exciting, is to have it be recognized at that level. We also offer for the younger students lunch bunches, which is like one of our teachers will go into the schools during lunchtime, and the students will meet in a separate room outside of the cafeteria for lunch, and they'll sing songs in Wampanoag, play games like go fish or things like that during their lunch break. And then similarly to the programs that happen in the tribal building, we also have after-school programs at the school. And again, it's kind of like, language activities. Sometimes they'll write Wampanoag stories, things like that. It's kind of like literacy based mostly. This year, we just launched our Canusi online program. And this is Tracy Kelly. This is our other newest trained linguist. And this was actually her master's project to launch this online site. It's got online, our archived lessons. A lot of our workbooks are stored there, so people can come to the website and sort of, follow along with a sequenced program from wherever they are. So they don't have to be local, which for a long time was a real barrier for a lot of our tribal families who are not close by. It also has, sound, so people can practice pronunciation, which has also been a challenge. And then we'll look at in a minute at a couple of words, and you'll see why sometimes pronunciation is a real challenge. And lastly, our immersion school is called Wôpanâak, which just means Weetamoo School. Weetamoo was a Wampanoag leader in the 1600s. The school is probably about 80% immersion throughout the day. The students usually will have their break times in the language of their choice, which is generally English. So, lunch and recess and things like that are typically not in immersion. Currently, our school is ages 3 to 9. We are in our 5th year. We started off with 14 children, and we now have 30. So we've expanded quite a bit. In 2022, we are expecting to expand up to grade 6. So we'll have enough of a cohort of our lower elementary students to expand upwards to a upper elementary. We also use Montessori pedagogy for our school, which has worked really well with our, the Wampanoag cultural components that we are trying to incorporate into our school. So it's really been a goal of ours to not only use Wampanoag language, but to base our teaching in Wampanoag culture as well. So we do a lot of things with the community. Our parents and the greater Wampanoag community are very involved at the school. Last year, just for a couple of examples, we have a lot of parents and grandparents that like to just sort of stop in, which is amazing. And, we'll just kind of like put the afternoon on hold for whatever it is that they will have for us. And with one woman who has a couple of grandchildren in our school, and she will frequently make homemade ice cream and, come in for an ice cream social. Or one parent last year called one of our teachers and said, I'm down the road and I just killed 3 ducks and I thought I'd come and let the kids learn how to pluck them. And so he came in with a few ducks and there were feathers everywhere, and the kids had a blast. And, you know, but these are the things that they get to do, you know, so that they're continuously learning, you know, what it is to not necessarily always do very cultural things, but to be in community with their tribe, in, you know, an intergenerational way, which has really been great. And going back for a minute to that elders lunch and learn class, like a lot of times our teachers will sort of use that class as kind of a sounding board for ideas and things that they want to do in the classroom, which is also really great. The school is housed currently on Mashpee Wampanoag land. And so at the moment, most of our students are Mashpee Wampanoag, just I think because of, you know, proximity, but our teachers are from all 4 Wampanoag communities, which is really great. It also helps for language learning because we do have more than one dialect of Wampanoag, and so the kids will hear that because, you know, speakers from Aquinnah who would have a different dialect, they'll hear that through their teachers as well. One of the other ways that our teachers have involved our community and our families is through trying to talk through like the goals and missions of our school. And one of the ways that we did that a few years ago was to think about what our goal is as teachers and community members supporting our school, and how the goal is to decolonize our community. And so in a parent meeting, we decided to make words for colonization and decolonization. And we do a lot of word reconstruction because our language hadn't been spoken for so long. Like there are no words documented for these things. And so we created these 2 words. And the word that we came up with for colonization is Chachika no Masawayi Wôpanâak. And that means, and you can see in the box on the left here, all the parts of that. And so the first part cha, means, it just kind of emphasizes the next part, really. And the next part is cheek, which is violently or forcefully. So like continuously or consistently over time, violently. Anom is inside. Asawayonkan is a box. And then ahi is like something that you do to someone else. And then onk makes it a noun. And so the word for colonization that we built means the act of constantly forcing someone into a box. And so then, of course, we made a word for decolonization. And rather than make it the opposite, like it is in English, we really tried to think about what it is that we're trying to do when we're decolonizing. And so our word is nompi sompon, I'm sorry, nompi sompom, oh my goodness, this one's not coming out. Nompi sompomonta monkaniok. And so the nompi means again, sompwa is righteously. It's actually the middle part there. There's some morphology happening where the part of the word is gone, but montamuonkan is life. The ee is to act purposely with your body, and the onk again is to make a noun. And so the word for decolonization is the act of intentionally living righteously again. And so that's what we're trying to do with all of our programming, but specifically in this case, we were looking at our school and what we're trying to do there. And so that's kind of what we've been up to. Before I finish, I'll just kind of take a minute to talk about what I think this has meant for me and for our community. And I think that all of these things have really created in our community a real sense of nompi sompomon tamuankaniak, of decolonization and how we are supposed to live. There are so many things in the language that make things so much more clear about how we are supposed to be living as Wampanoag people. And at, I think, almost all levels, whether people are, fluent or nearly fluent, or actively learning Wampanoag, or whether they're, just seeing signs on, the housing department door that says housing. I think that knowing that our language is in use and that we are not so separated from it anymore, makes people really realize that we're not so separated from our culture either, and that it's here anytime people want to connect to it. All they really have to do is just make that choice to be there. I think it's kind of common for people to say that, that we lost our language or our language is gone. But reality is that the language has not ever gone anywhere, right? I mean, the names for things have always been the names for things, right? Whether it's, the state of Massachusetts, or, the word for a skunk, right? Those are both Wampanoag words. And, a skunk is still a skunk and Massachusetts is still Massachusetts. And whether or not we know what that means, that's the difference. And so it's up to us to decide to remember. It's not about the language being gone. And so I think that that's been a really important and very noticeable difference, at least in the time that I've been involved in language. Take down my PowerPoint now.
Thank you, Nitana. That was really beautiful. I loved hearing about sort of what's been happening in the last really decade and then some since this movie, came out. And one of the things I was struck by, I love that the intention is very clear. I mean, literally in terms of defining what decolonization means in Wampanoag is that intention. And you just said this idea of to remember, and that actually reminds me a lot. One of the readings we had in this particular course was by Lisa Hall, and her articulation of decolonization is in fact to remember. And I just love that little connection that came in there. I have a couple of questions for you. One of the first things that struck me in your presentation right now was the fact that you have sort of an all ages approach. A lot of times when, folks are doing language work, it's, we're starting with the children. But I love that you have, high schoolers, adults, elders. Can you kind of speak to sort of what that's able to provide the community by being in various spaces, whether that's like a high school classroom or when elders get together, for lunch?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for us, because we don't have native speakers at this point, or at least we don't have adult native speakers, the learning really is at all levels. So in other communities where it's about revitalization, mm-hmm. as opposed to reclamation, yeah. There's less focus on older generations because that's where the language is still living on some level. For us, that's not necessarily the case, and so actually for us, most of our most advanced speakers we're mostly in our like 30s and 40s. Mm. And so so the focus on learning really kind of goes both up and down from there. And so I think what is nice about that is that, again, so, the elders really do kind of enjoy their time to learn on their own, I think. But also, like, a lot of the women, and it's mostly women, there are a few men, but mostly the language, the elders class is mostly women. A lot of them really love to come into the classes for the children. And, they know that they can't maintain immersion, while they're there, but they can come in and they can, identify what kids might be doing, or they might be able to, they definitely can say hello or introduce themselves or ask how they're doing and what they're doing. And so while sometimes there's, you know, a different, you know, outside of the school, you know, of course there's that like grandparent grandchild or
Right.
elder child relationship, which looks a little different, but there's almost a level where they're almost like peers. And so I think it really fosters a closeness with the youngest children in particular and the elders, because it's a lot easier for them to find a common ground than it might be, you know, in other parts of their community life.
Well, that's beautiful. And it shows that they're learning together, quite literally. One of the things you just mentioned, and I would love for you to touch on this, but is there a reason why the effort is reclamation as opposed to revitalization? Because often that's the word we hear, revitalization. Why is it that, you know, the Wampanoag effort is reclamation? Can you kind of help define that for the audience?
Sure. So Wampanoag language hasn't been spoken. We don't actually know when the last fluent people passed away, but we suspect that it's probably like 150-ish years ago. And so we don't have, or we didn't have, I should say, we didn't have a spoken language to revitalize. It really was about finding our way back to what we had moved away from and making it ours again, like in a tangible sort of a way, as opposed to just sort of improving what was there, because for many people it wasn't there at all, and for most people, you know, there was very little understanding of what even was around us. Like, you know, if you come to Cape Cod or southeastern Massachusetts, like all of the, you know, you see Wampanoag language really all around you on every street sign and place name and, you know, town name. But I don't think that's really something that people really realized. I don't know that most people really recognized that Mashpee. Like, we all kind of know what Mashpee means. We all kind of know what Aquinnah means, but, you know, nobody really thought like, okay, here's why I've seen different spellings of it. And here's why, you know, sometimes it has a G at the end. Why is that, you know? And so those are things that people are starting to realize. But we didn't have sort of a baseline to start from and just get better at. We really had to kind of start all the way from the beginning.
Right. And from very old documents as well. How wonderful to have access to those too. But one of the things you just said, and I really appreciate this, is making it ours again. The idea that you did have to reclaim something that was quite literally taken from you. So I think that's just really beautiful. And I think now it's the time for folks to start making that distinction between revitalization and reclamation, because they're similar projects, right? But there's a particular analytic going on there. And related to sort of the power of words and what that means, one of the questions I have for you is, you know, in this class, we've discussed the idea of language endangerment and also language death. And I'm wondering if you could comment on sort of how Native communities should approach this rhetoric of loss and death.
Right. Yeah, so I think it's so kind of connected to what I was saying before. Like, it's not, I think, about languages dying or languages disappearing or, you know, any of these sort of fatalistic terms that we put on on language, other than that. I mean, I guess the one thing that I think does make sense in that sort of terminology is the idea that that metaphor kind of assumes that language is living, right? And so, because I do believe that it is, and I believe that, you know, language changes and language evolves, and we evolve with it, and sometimes, you know, we cause that evolution, and sometimes, you know, there are external factors, but it does have its own life. But I think that again, like it's not that language can cease to exist, because it really can't. Because if you're a speaker of any language, I mean, even if it's English, right?
Mm-hmm.
If this is water to you, then it's never not water,
Right?
That's what it's called. Like then that's what it is.
Right.
And so it's just about coming to that knowledge. That knowledge doesn't cease to exist. It just has to be acknowledged.
Right.
And so I think that, I don't think that languages die. They're just unrecognized. And it's up to us to make sure that we're recognizing them, and it's not something that happens without work, right? We have to actually work to do that. Just like you would maintain any relationship, you have to work towards it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I really appreciate that, because I think we often hear like it's dying, and there's this, I think it might be a great way to get funding. I mean, some people can secure grants based on that sort of alarmist mentality. But I think they're holding on to the fact that, as you're saying, water, it will always be called that. It is that, right? Is understanding that there's sort of like a hope to the other side of it,
Right. And I think the idea of something dying, like if something is dying, you can't necessarily do anything about that, right? Yeah. Whereas with languages, like we absolutely have the power to make that not happen.
Yeah.
But we have to actually do it.
Great, thank you. One of the questions I had, and this is just something that came up also in some of the questions that my students had, is, part of this decades-long project involved partnerships with non-native linguists and specialists. And I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to that relationship, because obviously you're in a very fortunate position where you are a specialist and you are native and you're from your community. But at one point, your community was working with non-native linguists. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of comment on that relationship.
Sure. And we actually still are too. And so in the film, it talks about Jessie's relationship with Ken Hale and how he began helping in the early years of the project. And he's since passed away, but also in the film, Norvin Richards is interviewed. He's the man with the long red beard. And he is still very much involved with Wampanoag language. He does a lot of our grammar research. He is the one currently working with our dictionary. He's kind of constantly editing our dictionary. And so we work with him quite a bit. That relationship is about as good as any relationship I think has ever been between a tribe and an academic, a non-native academic. He's incredibly respectful. He will, make his suggestions, and he'll let us know, exactly why he thinks what he thinks. But we always have the final say. And so that has been, I think, really fortunate, for one thing, that we have him both as a resource and as an ally, and also as someone who, because for those of us who are Wampanoag and are, kind of tasked with the linguistic work and the social work,
right?
It's hard to be in the linguistic side of it all the time. And so to have him doing that, as much as he does, is really, really lucky. And yeah, it's amazing actually to be able to have someone behind the scenes like that. And our staff, he's accessible to all of us. And yeah, we're just, I don't know, I can't even really say enough how lucky we are to have him, really.
That's really,
also,
really
I recognize that that's not everybody's experience. Not everyone has someone who is, as dedicated and as, understanding of their role.
Right. I think that's really wonderful. In thinking about sort of the method of allyship, particularly as I think there are some linguists in the room, right? And some folks who are interested in working with the Native communities and helping either revitalize or reclaim Indigenous languages. And I think this just sort of goes to say, there is an opportunity for you to work with communities. I think it's just the method in which you work. And I'm actually right now taking a Washoe language class with linguist Brian Bachnick at University of British Columbia. And it's so cool that we get to be in that space and that I can virtually be there, right? Because of this new world that we all live in. But it's very gratifying when, you know, linguists do work with communities and really make an effort to try and sort of bridge that gap that, you know, as you were saying, academics in the past, whether it's, you know, anthropologists or whatever, there wasn't always a great relationship. And so I think shifting that and seeing it work in your community's situation as well is really, really wonderful. And to see that. So I think there's a lot of potential for sort of doing it the right way, as you're saying.
Right.
So great. One of the things that wasn't discussed in the film, but I feel like this might be an important sort of note of for this particular project, but the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, your tribe, was actually fairly recently recognized, right? We've talked about recognition in my class, and you know, it's always that whether or not the state recognizes you, like you, or the nation for that matter, you are Native, right? So I know, you know, from a young age, you grew up like, of course I'm Native. What does that do for a community sort of with struggling through that process of recognition? And I'm really curious if that affected language reclamation work in particular.
Yeah, so yeah, our last 12 or so years, our first, our initial decision on federal recognition was 2007. So that's when we were first awarded. And since then, or well, maybe not quite that long, but for the last 10 years anyway, we have been pursuing a casino, and that has caused a lot of trouble for us.
This sounds like California.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so, you know, we've been sued. We've had multiple different, you know, I don't know. It's been kind of a crazy mess. But at one point, I think it was 2015 maybe, when the Department of the Interior decided that we had wrongfully been granted. No, it couldn't have been 15. It had to be after Obama, so 16 maybe. Decided that we were wrongfully granted recognition, and so that put our land in danger, which is where our school currently is, and our teachers are not state certified. They all have Montessori training. Well, not all of them. Some of them have Montessori training. Our lead teachers do, but most of our staff is not, you know, certified teaching assistants. I'm not a certified school director, and so there have been we haven't had to go any different route yet, but we have had to sort of come up with a plan B, you know, and sort of have that in our back pocket just in case. Actually, just last week, the Biden administration reversed again that decision, and so we're actually, I guess, at least for now, in the clear with our land. And some of the I'm not really sure, I don't know the legal terminology, but a group of private citizens in the town where our casino is proposed to be built, they dropped their lawsuit as well. And so right now there are actually no barriers, which, right, is very good. And so, so there's nothing sort of on the horizon that might threaten the land at the moment. So it's nice to kind of have a sense of security over over that, but it's not necessarily even federal recognition that's sometimes a obstacle, because our language hasn't you know, had continuous speakers. there's sometimes, even within our community, a lot of skepticism over what we are doing in language, and whether or not, you know, we know what we're talking about, or whether or not we made it up. There, you know, some people claim that that is the case. And so it also kind of depends. So right now, almost all of our programming that happens in Mashpee, because before all of this litigation that was happening over you know, casino land and all of our tribal land, we had a financial backer for the casino who was pumping a lot of money into our tribe, and so we have, you know, we had a lot of money at kind of our discretion that was supplementing our language department.
Great.
And so that's kind of how we ended up in Mashpee, because Mashpee had the resources to house us, basically.
Yeah.
After some of the, you know, these lawsuits and things happened, that money slowed down really dramatically. I don't know if it will pick back up again now that, you know, there's more likelihood of the investors having, you know, recouping their money. So I don't know if that will mean that we'll have, you know, more resources for language again. But again, so we have tribal elections coming up in Mashpee in another month or so. And so, you know, it kind of, we don't know who's going to be elected, and whether or not that person is going to be someone who is supportive of language or isn't supportive of language.
Right.
And so there's always, you know, those kinds of things that that could cause upheaval for the programming that's happening.
Thank you for commenting on that, because I think some of the words that came up when you were describing that was, you know, danger and threat to both your land, to the school, to the future also of the Wampanoag language and the work that you all have been doing for so long. So I think it's important to sort of, for folks to be mindful of the fact that things could turn like that very fast and can really affect and damage the work that you all have been doing for quite some time. And also the fact that in some cases, this type of recognition could be more resources, for instance, for language work. So thank you for commenting on that. I really appreciated it. One of the sort of things that came up also in the film, and I'm really excited to sort of think about this question, particularly in the sort of theme of my Indigenous feminisms course. But in the film, we learned that the Wampanoag word for woman is the one who has complete say or judgment. I love that. And then that's really contrary to sort of the gender relations that we have today. So I'm wondering if you can speak to either gender relations as understood in the Wampanoag language, or even sort of ways that sort of things are reshaped through understanding the language and relations.
Yeah, so Wampanoag kinship is matrilineal. And I think that's something, you know, that's something that we've always known, whether we've known it, you know, whether we've been kind of, you know, in relationship with our language or not. That's something that we've always known. But there are definitely, especially in terms of kinship, there really are a lot of clues in the language that clarify that. So, so that's one example. And so I think Nikki is also talking about the word for man in the film, which is washkitomp, and that means like someone who's just like on the surface, right? So like someone who's like walking on land, basically. And so then, you know, compare that with the word for woman, which is the one with the judgment. And so the word for woman is also the word for wife. But there's a separate word for husband, and the word for husband is a dependent noun. And so we have like two classes of well, there's a lot of ways you can kind of classify nouns in Wampanoag, but one of the ways is either independent or dependent. And man and woman are both independent nouns. You can just say like, that's a man, and you don't have to talk about who's man or what kind of man it is. But a lot of kinship terms, you have to say who they belong to. Right. So you can't just be a sister. You have to be her sister, my sister, somebody's sister. And husband is like that. And so I think it's interesting that, you know, you can be a wife, but you have to be somebody's husband. You have to belong to somebody.
Yeah.
And also the word for husband is the one that follows. So that's, you know, obviously kind of makes sense with the word for woman with matam wasas. So also, you know, stepping away from the husband and wife words, but some of the words for like aunts and uncles, for example. So the words for like maternal aunt and uncle are different than the words for paternal aunt and uncle. And the words for like a maternal aunt is like the little mother. So like that's like, it's like that's like pretty much like your mother, right? Like that's your like real close family. The word for your father's sister is not like, it doesn't have that same really close relationship. And so there's so much of that in the language that just kind of reinforces the relationships and how they're structured.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for that. And then I realize I'm kind of looking at the time. I want to make sure that we have time for sort of a larger Q&A. But one of the questions, this is just, I'm kind of selfish, but I'm so curious. What is one of your favorite Wampanoag words?
Oh man. Well, if I just picked like an independent word, like by itself, I would have to say that it is probably Natuquas, because I just really like how it sounds, and that's the word for wolf. But in Wampanoag, you can have like one word, but it's like a whole sentence in English.
Right.
And so, yeah, so it might still be a word, but it would mean like a lot more than that. So anyway, yeah, I guess I'll just stick with Natuquas for now.
Okay. Well, now I invite sort of, let's open it up to the Q&A. I see we already have some questions. So for those of you in the audience, I ask you to use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature. And the Q&A feature, we already have a couple of questions going, so we can try and address some of those. And for those of you in my class, I did see that quite a few of you posted up discussion questions. Please go ahead and throw them in the Q&A now. And I have a couple as well that I printed up, so we can also go through those too. I think first we have just a quick clarification question here. Are descendants included in the eligibility to take classes? If not, why is that?
So Wampanoag like citizenship requirements are pretty much by descendancy. Like we don't use blood quantum. I'm pretty sure Apprentice doesn't use blood quantum either. So descendancy is kind of already how we would do it. But yes, I mean, you can, so like I said, any tribal citizen of those 4 communities is eligible to take class, and so is anyone that lives with those people, but you can also make a special request to take classes if you don't fit in one of those categories. And I don't think that, you know, anyone who can legitimately say like, you know, I'm not enrolled, but my grandmother was, or my sister is, or whatever, like I can't imagine that that person would ever not be, you know, welcome to take class. So yeah, pretty much in general, yes, descendants can take classes.
Cool. We have another question. It's a couple of parts. So let me see if I can try and boil it down to one. But in what ways does reclaiming the Wampanoag language open a sense of consciousness for all forms of life that the English language commonly refers to and imagines as inanimate, such as water, as you mentioned earlier, stars, and others named in the documentary? And then can you please expand more on the process of rebuilding words through sound changes from other languages to Wampanoag, kind of like the sister languages? So if you could kind of respond to that question as well.
Sure. So there are like 7, some people would say 6, but I usually say 7 different ways to decide if something's going to be animate. to be able to tell if something's animate. And
Wow.
if I can remember them off the top of my head, I will try. One is that it gets around on its own. So that's like, you know, animals and people basically. One is that it moves something else, right? So it like it propels something. So that could be like wind. It could be like a feather. It could be a paddle, right? So those are some examples. One is that it causes something to go in a complete circle. So this is kind of a weird one. We don't have a ton of examples of this, but like an example would be like an axle, right? So it doesn't itself go in a complete circle necessarily, but it allows something else to, right? Like a wheel.
Wow.
Let's see, so that was 3. Another one is that it restricts the movement of something else that's animate. So like a net.
Oh, okay.
Or like an arrow. One is that it's used in ceremony. One is that it is part of a creation story.
Oh, wow.
And then one is that it is made of something else that's animate. I think that was 7. So so those are the ways that we determine whether something is animate. And we often will get it wrong, you know, because if we don't especially the things that are like either used in ceremony or creation stories. So like if it's part of a creation story that we don't know, or part of a ceremony that we don't know, then, you know, it's something that might be miscategorized. But it definitely, you know, I think in the film it does talk about stars, right? And I think we also talked about, you know, pine trees and how those things are animate. Other things that, like other examples of things that are animate. So like waves are animate.
Oh, wow.
Because the moon is animate, because it goes around, or it moves on its own. So those are things that, you know, those are some examples. What else is another example of clay is animate? I'm not exactly sure why, but clay is animate. And so because clay is animate, a brick is animate because it's made of clay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so those are some examples. As for rebuilding words is simultaneously so fun and so hard.
Oh, I bet.
And I mean, like something like, you know, colonization and decolonization, to build those words, like that's really fun, right? As someone who, you know, spends a fair amount of time thinking about those concepts, like I know what I would want to use to create those words. When we're thinking about, you know, things like words for, you know, for our natural environment here in Massachusetts, like those are things that are not really documented, unfortunately. You know, they don't talk about like, you know, white-tailed deer in the Bible, for example, you know? So, I mean, that's a word that we have, but the idea is the same, you know? So kind of like obscure species of plants, or very specific species, for example, are not things that we have words for. And that's really difficult to do, I think. We can use sister languages, and that works. I mean, it helps, I should say. But, you know, oftentimes we can find that, you know, let's say we're looking for, well, a couple weeks ago, we were looking for a word for jewelweed, I think, because somebody had written a story and we were trying to translate it, and they talked about jewelweed in the story. And so we looked at other sister languages that had words for jewelweed, but they weren't all the same. Like they were not cognates between each other.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, okay, well, which one do we decide to go with? What do their words mean? And which one makes sense for us? Now, sometimes it's a matter of geography, right? So if we're looking at Ojibwe versus looking at Passamaquoddy, like, okay, so Passamaquoddy maybe has got more of a similar landscape to us. So maybe that makes more sense, which means that maybe their use for an item might be more similar than, you know, Ojibwe, for example. But that's not, of course, always the case, right? You know, we don't necessarily know. And again, like in the case of plants and animals, which is something that we find ourselves most often having to rebuild. I find, at least for me, I find that I am constantly asking my dad, like, what is this even for? What do you do with this? Where do you find it? Like, you know, and sometimes he knows, but sometimes he doesn't know. So then I'm like, really like, oh, dang it, where now what? So, you know, because to rebuild something in Wampanoag, like, you know, as you can see from the, like, you know, colonization, decolonization words, like each piece really means something. So we can't just say, like, you know, if I wanted to make a word for jewelweed, like maybe I want to talk about like anti-itch plant, right? But maybe I don't want to talk about it like that. Maybe somebody else has a different idea of what the first thing is that comes to mind about jewelweed. And so that's really hard, is to know, like, okay, that's what I think about when I think of it, is putting it on mosquito bites, but like maybe somebody else thinks of something else. And who's right? I don't know. Right. You know, I remember this was several years ago, but we created a word for truck, and we still debate about whether or not the word we created is the right one. And so the word that we made means, like, so we made the word for car, and we made the word for bus, and like all of these. And so they're kind of all similar, and they all mean like the thing that rolls in a certain kind of way. And so the word for truck is like, it rolls and has like a hole, right? Like the bed of the truck. And that's what we landed on, but I still like swear that this should not have been the word. And so my opinion at the time was that it should have been like the vehicle that's used for work. And so that's just kind of an example of how, like, when we're rebuilding, like, who is really to say, right? So if my perspective on a truck is like the thing that's like for utility, but somebody else's perspective on a truck is just like how it's shaped, then, you know, we really haven't, like, that just makes it so clear that we really don't know how people would have named something that we don't have. And again, when we're looking at sister languages and they're not the same, then it kind of makes it difficult to decide how to choose that. But the process of rebuilding words off of other languages, it is really cool when we can, you know, rebuild a word and, you know, use our corresponding sound chart and look at what it might be. And then all of a sudden, you know, it might not necessarily come, you know, be really obvious at first. But once we start to put the pieces together, sometimes it's kind of like this huge light bulb goes off and we're like, yes, that makes perfect sense, you know? And, you know, when that happens and it just comes together in this perfect, beautiful word that looks so Womp, it's great. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, but often enough to be encouraging.
Well, it sounds very gratifying. So we have another question here. From your observations, what, if any, effect has the fact that the Bible is the primary source of recovering your language had on that process?
I think it's been enough of a help that people are sort of willing to look past the, you know, the problems associated with what it means. We are pretty confident that the Bible was translated by native speakers and not by colonists. And so I think that really helps to sort of move past the Bible as a Bible, and really think about it in terms of a document written by our family, you know, as a way to help in this process. At least that's the kind of how I like to look at it. I mean, of course, it's, we're really lucky to have it, because I speak with people all the time who have, who are trying to learn their language, who are trying to, do what we have been able to do, but just don't have the resources that we have. And so, as much effort as they might put in, like, there just may not be enough to really, complete, have enough to really rebuild from.
Right.
And so I really recognize that we're just so lucky, and it kind of, I don't know, to me, it just kind of doesn't matter what the document is. And I just really try to focus on the fact that, like, our ancestors wrote that.
Yeah.
And maybe they knew, maybe they knew that that we were going to need it someday.
Right. I really love that, because I think that's, coming from California, we know a lot of anthropologists at the turn of the century went to Native communities sort of with the understanding that they were going to vanish, and try to document languages as much as possible. And so a lot of California Indian people, have to go to these anthropological resources to build things. And I have heard a similar argument that, like, what, they knew what they were doing, our ancestors, when they sat down with these anthropologists and these linguists, and this is our story and this is our language. So again, that kind of idea of reclaiming, right? So I really think that's really beautiful. There's a question here about, I think this is about May. I would love an update on the young girl in the documentary. Any thoughts on May?
So May is 16.
Wow.
Yep. She is, I think, a junior at, I'm actually not sure where May goes to school right now. They have, Jessie and her husband have a house on Martha's Vineyard, because he's from Aquina, and a house here. Actually, they talk about that in the film. So so they sort of spend time in both places. So I'm actually not sure if she goes to school on the island or here, but yeah, she's great. I think they still do use Wampanoag at home quite a bit. I don't know if it still is as frequent as it was when she was little, as it probably would be with, friends coming in and out of the house that don't speak Wampanoag and whatnot. But yeah, no, she's doing good.
Great. I can't believe she's 16. Carrie has a really great question. How is COVID-19 impacting your language work?
Yeah. It depends on sort of what part of it, but in terms of access for people who have not had access in the past, it's actually probably been a really great benefit.
Really? Okay, good.
We've gone back and forth a lot over the years about whether or not to put Wampanoag online and to have access that way. And we never really did it until now. And the debate has always sort of been drawn by, like, generationally, by generational lines. And now that, it's either put it online or don't teach it at the moment. It has, there are people, one of our teachers has a class where she has a student in, I think, Finland who attends her class. And it's like 4:00 in the morning or something, because her class is late at night. It's like crazy. It's a crazy hour, and he wakes up and he comes to class. And so obviously that would not ever have happened, for families that live far. I mean, it wouldn't even have happened if someone lived in, New York, never mind, across the ocean. And so I think that's been a really great benefit for people, to be able to have access that they didn't have before. I mean, I think, Tracy, in her development of the Canusi website, I mean, she started that before COVID happened. Wow. And so whether or not, it would have been launched with so much, support behind it, had we not had to do this also anyway, it's hard to say, but, it was really serendipitous, the timing of it. And so for so many, I think it's actually been really wonderful to have that option. You know, and at least for a while, I don't know about how it's been in California exactly, but I feel like in the springtime here, in the, you know, the beginning of COVID, things were a lot stricter here in terms of restrictions. And so, you know, everyone really was staying home. And so looking for things to do remotely, you know, people were really trying to find ways to connect. And so I think that was really helpful. In other ways, like our language school has been entirely remote for this whole school year. Well, for almost a year now, for 11 months. And so that's been really challenging for, you know, little kids on Zoom.
Yeah, of course.
And so, you know, they're not getting nearly as much immersion as they would have if they were in the classroom, because they're being home, they're being taught by their parents to some degree, who are not necessarily speakers. And, you know, the teachers are sometimes having to talk to the parents, you know, through the screen. And so, you know, they're having to switch into English to do that. And so again, so depending on who we're talking about, it's, you know, it's in some ways been really great, and in some ways been really challenging.
So I have this question is technically 3 parts, but I think you can answer it as sort of one. And maybe this speaks to it, but what is the biggest challenge you've faced while working to revive the Wampanoag language? How have these challenges affected the community? And have you faced any kind of criticisms while working on this?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest challenges that we typically face that's kind of ongoing, as I mentioned before, is the people within our community who are not supportive for whatever reason. And sometimes it's just that, you know, some people feel like, you know, we were Wampanoag before our language was, you know, in this state of reclamation, and we still are, and so we don't need it. There are people who think that, again, like, you know, that it's just all, that we just made it all up, or that Jessie made it all up. And so those, I think, are the hardest obstacles to overcome, because it makes it difficult sometimes for us to reach people, really, right? So, you know, we often will want to, you know, offer classes to as many people as we can, or, you know, hold programs that, you know, for youth or for whoever. And sometimes it's just hard to kind of get past, like, kind of the questioning of the intention, I guess. Right. And I would definitely not say that it's common. I think it's kind of you know, it's sort of an isolated small group of dissenters, I guess. But I think that for those of us who are working really hard to create something that will be, you know, with us, hopefully forever, you know, and that will have these really positive impacts on our youth, on our families. I think that's really a challenge, is to kind of hear that, that like questioning of the intentions of a family, you know?
Yeah, that kind of reminds me that I know when I first started doing language work, one of the themes that kind of came up among folks that I knew sort of engaged in similar work was everybody does actually have an opinion on language revitalization or reclamation, whether or not to do it, whether to do it, you know, written or just orally. You know, there's a lot of kind of different opinions, and it's hard to have those kinds of conversations, but ultimately you have to have them. They will happen, you know. And yeah, I appreciate you answering that. So we have another question. This is kind of related to maybe what would have not happened if you didn't do your work, but what do you think would have happened to the community if the Wampanoag language had not been revived?
I don't think that there would have been, any sort of like detrimental, events or anything like that. I mean, I think that we would still be, we'd still be here. We would still be, on our land doing,
Right.
kind of doing what we'd always been doing. But I think it would have been a harder road in a lot of ways. And I'm kind of specifically speaking about Mashpee right now, right. Because there has been, so part of our whole process of federal recognition that has been taking place for the last several years, our land, our trust application for our land relied heavily on language to make connections to our homeland. Wow. There are areas in our application for our reservation that are not necessarily in Mashpee or close to Mashpee, but that we know are where our people came from because of the name of the locations and family names that are still in existence now. And so those kinds of connections are things that, people who weren't trained in Wampanoag wouldn't have been able to make those connections. Right. And so, I don't necessarily think that there would have been, any sort of like events that would have, been isolated problems, but we would have definitely had, we may not be as far as we have come, at least in Mashpee, had we not had this to help us.
Great. And I think this is a related question, but can you speak to how reclamation assists sovereignty? I think that relates to the point you just made.
Yeah, right, exactly. I think that we've been able to really use language as sort of like proof of who we are and who, how we have remained. Just to expound a little bit on the example I just gave. So the piece of land where the casino is proposed is in a city called Taunton, which is about, it's about like 40 minutes from Mashpee. And the area where it's going to be built, theoretically at least, is a place called Wôpanâak, and Wôpanâak means like cleared space, basically, like an area that's, like a field. And so there is a family name in Mashpee, Wôpanâak, and that's the, anglicized pronunciation of it now. But they're pretty clearly the same word. And that family came to be in Mashpee as a result of the community that was in Taunton at that time having to leave around the time of King Philip's War. And so, of course, there's so much research that went into, finding that information, but those kinds of details in our, tens of thousands of page documentation for our, land and trust and federal recognition petitions obviously really helps to prove connections, and right to land and right to place. And I think in addition to that, now that we're sort of on the other side of the application process, grant funding and things like that have really been more, we have a lot more access now that we have language to sort of infuse into applications or to, we have more access to certain programs that have an expectation of language included.
Great. This is a really cool question. Would you, and I think I know some of the answers, but would you consider revitalizing the Wampanoag language as a form of healing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think about, our Immersion School. And I think about, like if I go back to like when I was that age, when I was in school, and I think back on my experience as, you know, a elementary student or even middle school student in Mashpee, when I was a kid, probably maybe like 10% of the students in Mashpee schools were Wampanoag. Now it's probably more like 5 to 7, if I had to guess, just because of the expansion of the town. I think when I was a kid, like Mashpee had like 1,800 residents or something like that, and now it's like 18,000. So in the last, you know, 30 or so years, it's undergone a pretty large growth. And when I was young, I feel like there was a real disconnect between some families. And it was sort of like, you know, these families didn't maybe interact with these families, or these families were sort of like known to fight. You know, there's kind of those sorts of things, which I guess probably happens in a lot of tribal communities. But I think that now, like, I look at the kids in our school, and I look at, you know, my children who attend, and who their friends are, and, you know, they're, you know, my child's best friend at school is someone that, like, I barely knew, you know, the child of someone I barely knew when I was a kid. And they're, you know, not even really like very distantly related to me from at all, you know. It's just someone that I really never spent much time with. And so I think that these kind of connections that the children are making because they don't know any better, really are helping, like, all of us to kind of come together, you know. I mean, as the head of school, like, I've began to build relationships with some of the parents who I don't even know if I would have necessarily, you know, said more than like a quick kind of glance and hello in the grocery store to before, you know. And now we're spending, you know, a half an hour on the phone once a month. And so I think that that is happening a lot between the parents of the kids in the school, you know, because there's play dates and there's, you know, parent meetings, and so these people are coming together for their children, in a way that they really probably wouldn't have otherwise.
That's very special. I like to hear that. And one related question is, as you are in the classroom, right, what are some of your favorite memories in teaching Wampanoag children to speak their language?
Well, I think because they're young and they're not always, so the teachers are in immersion all the time. The students kind of go back and forth, right? So if you walk into one of our classrooms, from the students, you will hear more English than you will hear Wampanoag. So I think probably one of the best things to see in the classroom is when teachers are engaged with students and it really is full immersion. And there's a handful of students who can do that, you know, without much trouble. So it's not that they can't, it's just that, you know, for the ones who are still learning or might be new, and they're using English, it does, you know, it is hard to keep English out of the classroom. But I think when the children really are engaged in the language, or when they're reminding someone else to use Wampanoag, like my daughter, who is 7, she just turned 7 on Tuesday. She is, not to brag, but she is probably one of the better Wampanoag speakers at our school. She's in 1st grade, and she like, she will remind me at home sometimes. She'll remind my other children who speak, or not necessarily remind. She'll just say, like, hey, let's speak Wampanoag right now. And I think, you know, those are the moments where we realize that it's not like that it's not just like a moment in time. Like, it's not just us as teachers who are giving this to these children and then, like, that's going to be it. But, like, children like Adeline, or, you know, maybe other kids in the school, maybe not necessarily in her class right now, but maybe 5 years from now, there will be another one like her who is just really committed to using it. And, you know, fast forward 20 years or 30 years, and then they're going to be in this position of doing this for, you know, for their children. And I think it's like, it's really those moments that we realize that like, what we're doing is not like isolated in time. It's the beginning of something that will be ongoing.
That is so beautiful. And even, I mean, when that film came out, it was so brand new to me, and it's still very new to me. And to just think that like 11 years have passed. So, you know, we're already talking about May, who's 16. Very soon we'll be talking about your children who are teenagers, you know, and where that is going. And so a related question is, what does it mean for you to be able to raise your children in their community as Wampanoag language speakers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, in some ways it's really like amazing. Like just that, you know, that example of Addie doing that. And, you know, sometimes like my kids don't usually call me Nukas, which is the word for mother. They call me mom typically. But sometimes she'll just like randomly out of the blue be like, hey, Nukas, da 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 da, whatever. And it's just, you know, it's just so like when she does that, I'm just like, oh, yay. Like, aren't you so cute? And so I think like, it's really like reminds me, I think that, that this is really what we're supposed to be doing, and what I am supposed to be doing, to help them have this and not have to wait until they're, you know, 22 like I was, or, you know, 52 like someone else is, or whatever. So to have that from an early age, and even if they don't, you know, stick with it, if they don't stay in the immersion school, you know, forever, or if they, you know, decide not to take Wampanoag in high school or whatever, like they will at least have that foundation if they choose to come back to it later. And I think about like, you know, when I was a kid and I didn't have that option, you know, obviously there were things that I learned from, you know, my dad or other, you know, adults in my family, and in my community. But I think that, you know, like I can't even count all of the times since I've been learning Wampanoag that I've been like, oh, that makes so much more sense now, you know, like that happens like so often. And I feel like, you know, my kids will have that less, you know, because they'll understand that before. And I think that's really, really cool. The other side of that is that it sometimes is a lot of pressure. So, you know, my husband is not Wampanoag. He's from another tribe. And he is not a fluent speaker of Ho-Chunk, but he takes classes, you know, as much as he can. Ho-Chunk is from Wisconsin, so he, you know, he can't attend classes. He will do some remote stuff sometimes. But his brother is actually also a language teacher. And so, you know, he has a lot of pressure from him to make sure that he's using it with our kids. But I actually think that he being, you know, just kind of like a novice learner of Ho-Chunk, he uses Ho-Chunk more at home than I do Wampanoag at home, which I am not proud to say that, but it's the reality. And I think that it is a lot harder than I ever imagined it would be, to speak consistently at home. Because again, my husband doesn't speak Wampanoag. I mean, he knows a little bit, but again, he probably knows less Wampanoag than I know Ho-Chunk because he uses it more. So I've picked up on the things that he says to the kids. And he knows, you know, kind of the basic stuff like come and eat and time for bed and, you know, those kinds of things. But I think partly because I have a more, like I can say whatever I want pretty much to the kids. So it's like the things that I might say to them are not limited to those specific interactions. So he hasn't necessarily picked up on like, oh, that means that, because I hear that every single day and it's the only thing I hear. He might hear, you know, whatever. But I think that the pressure to turn like my kids into, you know, the next fluent speakers is high. And I don't know that I necessarily am getting like, it might just be my own pressure. Putting on myself. But it definitely, you know, it's not what I expected it to be. Because I think on one hand, like, you know, when my son was born, he's the oldest, I used a lot of Wampanoag at home with him at first. But then he learned to talk, and it wasn't in Wampanoag right away. And so, you know, I used a lot less as, you know, the older he got. And then as Wampanoag was sort of not established as like the language of the house, you know, the next one came along, and then it was like, okay, now it's less and less and less.
Right.
And so it's really, really difficult. Although, you know, as I said, like the moments when we're really successful at it, when we have like, you know, 5 minutes here or 10 minutes there where we're in immersion, it's awesome. And they, you know, they don't, when I speak to them in Wampanoag, they don't miss a beat. They know exactly what I'm saying, and they very rarely have to ask me. But getting them to respond is sometimes difficult, especially my son. He's like all set at home. He's like, that's for school. That's not what we do here. But the other side of that is that, you know, the fact that he associates like Wampanoag language and being Wampanoag with like the thing that he does at school is also like, I mean, I wish it was more than just at school, but like I can't be mad at the fact that he is like totally okay with being Wampanoag at school, you know, because not every kid has that. So
yeah, absolutely. It sounds like either way, it's still a sea change from even when you were, you know, a child.
Absolutely.
So we pretty much hit that time, but I do have one question for you. The final question is, what advice do you have for Native youth who are seeking to learn their native language? Where do you suggest they begin?
Well, I think it will definitely depend on, you know, what options they have available to them. But I would, you know, see if there is programming happening in their home community, wherever that is, if they're, you know, if they are proximate to that place, or if there's something going on online, and just take even the littlest thing that might be available to you. And not be concerned that you are not going to know what you're doing or not know what you're talking about. Because, you know, if you're brand new at it, like nobody in a beginner's class is going to know what they're talking about. And while the words might be hard to pronounce or they might be, you know, difficult to read, there's not like, it is your language and you are supposed to like have it. And so, you know, whether or not it comes easy is not really like the thing to worry about. The thing to worry about is just that you're like attempting to make that connection. And so, yeah, I would suggest just kind of taking whatever is available and, you know, trying to incorporate it in the littlest or the largest ways that you can. You know, make a little goal and say, okay, I'm going to learn how to introduce myself. And, you know, whatever that goal is, it doesn't have to be a fluent speaker by the end of the year, you know?
Because that would be really hard, even in just a year.
Exactly. And I think that often that's what happens is people sort of are like, well, oh my God, how come I don't know this already? I've been doing this for 6 months. Well, you know, and I think we just have to take it easy on ourselves and realize that like, it's not our fault that we don't have this and we don't know it. And, you know, getting it back is, you know, may take as long as it took to, you know, to get away from it.
Right. Great. Well, thank you so much, Nitana. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I feel very lucky that we got to have you. Carrie is saying thank you so much as well. I really appreciate you talking about Wampanoag language reclamation. And really, I think it's a wonderful space to consider this as not only a decolonial, but as well as a feminist practice. So thank you for really expanding on that. We have some cyber applause going on. Thank you all for joining us. And this will be actually uploaded onto the YouTube. So if you didn't get a chance to watch it all the way, or if you'd like to rewatch it again and share with friends, you're more than welcome to. So have a good night, everybody, and take care.
Aptanamo.